welcome you all to this international online conference jointly hosted by Business at OECD and ΣΕΒ Hellenic Federation of Enterprises, entitled The Evolution of Illicit Trade During the Pandemic, Lessons and Recommendations. On a logistical side, please let me remind you that this event will be recorded and it will be uploaded on the web. Furthermore, questions will be sent through the chat box and asked during the Q&A session. But now, let me emphasize why the topic that we are discussing today is of utmost importance. During the past 2 years, all countries across the world do their best to manage the pandemic, taking among other measures that affect our daily lives. In this challenging environment, illicit trade has adapted swiftly and unfortunately thrived. To better protect our countries, our businesses, and of course ourselves as consumers from the expansion of illicit trade, we need to adapt the way we act. But besides acting, it is always good to also discuss with experts that can share with us their valuable experience and insights. Therefore, before providing a brief overview of our agenda and presenting our speakers, I would like to thank them warmly for joining us today and for enriching this important discussion. Turning now to the agenda, the first session will provide an opportunity to learn more in detail about OECD's work on countering illicit trade. During the second session, we will explore how the private sector is cooperating with the OECD to counter illicit trade. The third session of the conference will shed a light on how Greece dealt with the pandemic and tried to combat illicit trade. The fourth session will present aspects and trends of the global market during the pandemic. The fifth session will be the interactive part of the conference, since it is the Q&A part. I would like to encourage all participants to actively engage in our discussions and not to hesitate to ask questions to our expert speakers to make this a truly interactive and lively event. The conference will conclude by giving an overview of the lessons learned from the pandemic and recommendations for next steps. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely thank Business at OECD for being our partner in this important event. Your input for organizing this meeting was very valuable and is most appreciated. We are looking forward to our continued cooperation in the future. So let's get started. We would like to welcome Ms. Hani Rosenbaum, Executive Director, Business at OECD, who will open the conference. She leads the business diplomacy efforts with the OECD and its members, guides the strategy and policy engagement on the Paris-based office. She works together with Business at OECD Executive Board and ensures that the organization adequately reflects the views of its national members organization. Ms. Rosenbaum, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good morning to all of you, depending on where you are. Let me just start by saying, and it's an enormous pleasure for me to provide some brief opening remarks at this important joint event, which we are very pleased to organize with our Greek member organization, ΣΕΒ. We just earlier today, it just came out of a meeting of our national member organizations, our annual planning meeting, and it was underlined how beneficial it is to have these joint events because it helps us reach the members and learn from your members on the ground. I would like to express my sincere appreciation and gratitude to Alexandros Hatsopoulos, Director General of ΣΕΒ, for his long-standing support to our activities. ΣΕΒ is actually one of our founding members, so we've had a cooperation which lasts almost 6 decades. And I'd also like to express our appreciation to your team for the initiative to set up today's meetings on this very important topic at a very important time, as we're trying to learn the lessons from a pandemic, which, as we know, is unfortunately not yet over. Let me just underline that as the official business voice to the OECD, which has worked with the OECD for almost 60 years, we have consistently underlined the importance of a global level playing field, a policy environment that is conducive to private sector-led growth, open markets for trade and investment, and good governance and integrity, both in the public sector and in the private sector. Now, with all this in mind, it really underlines that to realize these objectives, we must join forces, we must work together and take decisive action against illicit trade, which has impacts for business, for governments, and also for society at large. Of course, we in business, we cannot do it alone. That's why we are so pleased to have the OECD with us here at the meeting today and to work together. Why is the OECD so important? The OECD has convening power to organize an inclusive dialogue. The OECD also has the analytical capacity to provide evidence-based research, which help us better understand the complex risks of illicit trade to our global economies. And also I'd like to mention that the OECD as a multidisciplinary organization has a very important role to connect the dots, because illicit trade unfortunately involves many different sectors and happens in many different settings via maritime transport and e-commerce, among others. Now, we are therefore very pleased to have here with us today also experts from the OECD. Welcome to Martin Forst, who leads the Governance Reviews and Partnership Division at the OECD. And of course, our longstanding colleague and friend Piotr, who has worked with us for many years and who has been instrumental in establishing this excellent cooperation that we have today with the OECD Task Force on countering illicit trade. It's a cooperation where we do not only advise the OECD, but we have a real partnership, and we believe and hope that this is of mutual benefit. Now, I'd also like to mention that our anti-illicit trade expert group is one of our most active and most impactful policy groups that we have at Business at OECD. And this would not be possible without the fantastic leadership of David Luna, our chair. So David, thank you very much for this. I'd like to express on behalf of the Secretariat, on behalf of our members, our deep appreciation, our thanks to you, and also to the vice chairs for the excellent leadership you provide, the strategic guidance in driving this very important topic. Under your leadership, I really think we have achieved a lot. And thanks also to you as SEBI for the strong support. Now, we will hear more on how we are all working with the OECD, including on specific topics we are involved in, such as e-commerce, high-risk sectors, free trade zones. So thank you very much again for joining us today. I look forward to a very interesting discussion, and now I'd like to give the floor to the General Director of SEB. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your welcoming remarks. We continue with Mr. Alexandros Hadjopoulos. Mr. Hadjopoulos has been the Director General of ΣΕΒ, Hellenic Federation of Enterprises, since July 2019. He has a legal background and significant experience in the private sector. Mr. Hadjopoulos, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ninetta. Thank you, Ms. Rosenbaum, dear Hani. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Just a few words on behalf of ΣΕΒ, or SEV, as many of you may read it. It's the Hellenic Federation of Enterprises. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this online conference, which is jointly hosted, as you heard, with Business at OECD. We cooperated closely during the past few weeks to prepare this event. And here we are today, together with very distinguished speakers who were more than willing to share with us their very considerable insights. So thank you all for that. Just a few words about us. ΣΕΒ is a major business association in Greece. We work to strengthen businesses and their ability to be a force of positive change, not only in the economy, but also in the greater society. And our members, more than 4,000 companies, include the largest, most dynamic, extrovert and innovative businesses in Greece. They are the ones who provide us with the perspectives and the information from the ground, so that, among other things we do, we represent them and we engage with the government for the transformation of the regulatory environment towards a better and more resilient economy. In this line of work, our Business at OECD membership is an immensely increasing our capacity. And I feel I cannot skip this point. We access through this membership and through our cooperation invaluable intelligence on what's going on at an international level. And we have the opportunity to contribute and collaborate on key issues before we form our own proposals. And of course, before the relevant policies are formed, either at local or at European level. Illicit trade is definitely one of those issues, and a very, very important one. For a number of sectors, for a number of products, it distorts the playing field, seriously harms consumers, and of course, as it has already been heard before, it's totally incompatible with good governance and transparency. Such consequences for our economy have traditionally kept us busy with illicit trade issues, but we're at a time that the problem should probably be dealt with by looking at it with a new eye, a new perspective. Challenges such as the pandemic, but also the path to sustainability and the issues around it, urge us both, the private sector, but also the governments, to navigate through a drastically new environment. This is why we believe that this is a particularly opportune moment for an open discussion like this on illicit trade practices, as they underwent significant transformations during the pandemic, and they need to be re-examined in order to design effective ways for dealing with them. That was the foundation of our cooperation and our enthusiasm in view of today's event. Collaboration, learning from each other, sharing good practices, trying to break new ground in effectively dealing with illicit trade. Combining the insights and disseminating the work done from the OECD task force on countering illicit trade, the Business at OECD Anti-Illicit Trade Expert Group, WCO, the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, and our own General Secretary for Commerce and Consumer Protection in Greece will significantly take us further, advancing our common goals. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that will follow.
Mr. Halidopoulos, thank you very much for your intervention. We are now entering to the core part of our conference. Let's begin with our OECD speakers. Mr. Frost is the head of the Governance Reviews and Partnership Division, promoting key governance themes such as open government, gender in public life, and access to justice. He is responsible for OECD public governance reviews that provide countries with a strategic tool to improve the design, coordination, and implementation of public policies. He has been with the OECD since 1992. Mr. Frost, please take the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I want to, on behalf of the OECD and the task force on countering illicit trade, again, thank you that you have called us for this event. I mean, thank you very much for Business at the OECD, the host and our co-host, the Anti-Illicit Trade Experts Group. And very much want to thank the co-chairs, David Luna and Mr. Giustiani, for the long trust we have within the excellent cooperation. So today I want to talk in particular on illicit trade during the pandemic. And what we have done very much is developing first and providing evidence on illicit trade. That's the first task of our task force. And we can show very relevant findings. We have, of course, we're very proud that everybody cites our numbers, these huge numbers of illicit trade, but it is much more than a technical question. It's more than just the numbers. I mean, it is much more than even political. It's just that illicit trade has become, I think we can say it's a real threat to our modern economy, based very much on innovation. And illicit trade is not just an economic loss, it really undermines also good governance of the whole system, and it fuels organized crime. So just to give some aspects why illicit trade is really a severe and much wider question. And that means also that we are all trying to go towards post-COVID recovery, etc. And illicit trade can really pose a solid threat to that. So therefore also this time dimension, we say there is no time to waste, but here very much we have some notion of urgency. We have seen that COVID has very much changed the economic systems, the supply chain, etc. And the smugglers, they have already very quickly adapted to this change. It's the question whether we, from the policy side, have been so agile and so fast. So what we need today is really responses that are effective and that can be quickly adapted. And so we hear of course, from all of you that we have to work all together, because we know fighting illicit trade is not, it's not an easy exercise. It's a very, very complex task. That's why we always say, and it's good that we're all on the same page on this. We have to work together, the public sector, the private sector, international organizations, etc. And we at Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade, we're really trying to do our maximum, and we are having already a couple of areas that has been named before, free trade zone, container ships, etc., where we are proposing and starting to implement very concrete tools to have solutions. So this is just an introduction. It's great to be here with you today. And my colleague Piotr will follow me, giving more details about what the task force is doing. So thank you very much again to BIAC, to organizing, and our Greek host to organizing this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for your general remarks. They are very helpful. And now we can move on to your colleague for more details, Mr. Piotr Strichowski. He's a senior project manager at the OECD Public Governance Directorate in charge of the task force of countering illicit trade, and works together with delegates from OECD member countries, industry, academia, and other international organizations. Mr. Strichowski, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, dear colleagues, for having us at this important event. It's always good to see public and private sectors working together hand in hand in solving this really urgent and big problems. And that's why I cannot say how grateful I am to Hani and BIAC, and also to David and Alvise for making this initiative happen, for pushing these frontiers, and also for struggling with some bureaucratic inefficiencies that, well, are also our daily frustrations. Coming back to the topic of the OECD Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade, well, it's an official OECD body that I manage, and that basically deals with three main tasks. Next slide, please. Our main task is the green foundation, I would say, is the beginning of the arrow. It's the evidence. Illicit trade is illicit. Data are hard to find. There is lots of myths. There is lots of anecdotes around it. And our role is to really provide facts, is to shed some light in this darkness of criminal environment, in this problematic dark cellars where there's lots of problems. Some of them are anecdotal, some of them are bigger than appear. Once we provide evidence, then we slowly move into guidance. We slowly move from question how the situation looks like into why the situation looks like this. We scope, I would say, some gaps in modern governance structures that enable illicit trade to thrive these days. So that's the blue square. And once we scope these gaps, then we follow with implementation. Then we try to close it, right? And of course, OECD alone has de facto no power to close it. We do it together with partners. And our great partners are, of course, World Customs Organization. I'm really glad to see Maurice today, but also private sector. So let me reiterate my big thank you for being with us, not only as advisors, as Hani said, but also as partners. Let me now take a step back to evidence. Next slide, please. Over the past years, the Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade has been providing numerous photographs of illicit trade, right? Illicit trade, as I said, it's illicit, and we don't have the luxury that our colleagues from Directorate for Labor or even from Economics Directorate have. We don't have census data for illicit trade, right? Fortunately or unfortunately, criminals do not provide good statistics. What we have is, of course, enforcement data from our colleagues from customs, from police. But again, these data were not collected to make economists' life easy. These data were collected to improve enforcement. So what we do, we enhance this data with qualitative evidence, with lots of dialogues with experts from enforcement, from police, from industry community, from customs, from private sector. And I'm really glad that, well, many of you are not new to me. I've been in dialogues with you for many times, learning a lot about illicit trade. And a result of our efforts are a number of reports, photographs of illicit trade. These reports begin usually with an overall picture, presenting the situation from, well, I would say, distance, saying how big the scale is. Example, illicit trade in counterfeit products, 460 billion euros a year, dollars a year, $460 billion a year, right? GDP of Belgium. It's not a scale of a lottery jackpot, it's a scale of GDP. As Martin said, we are not talking about small issues. It's a vital threat to modern economies, especially now in this period of, well, hopefully post-COVID recovery, when we are desperately looking for engines, efficient engines of growth. Illicit trade is a really, not a pebble, it's a big stone in this engine that make and break it. Then from such big general pictures, we go into, I would say, smaller and smaller and smaller one, and then we arrive at governance gaps. Next slide, please. Then we see what are the holes, what are the missing components in current governance structure that, that might merit attention. And let me give one good example, our jewel in the crown, free trade zones. Over the past years, we discovered that there might be some, there is a lack of transparency in free trade zones that turned some of them into black holes of illicit trade. Some free trade zones turn into hubs of illicit trade where criminals erase their shipping manifests, manage to reroute the cargo in order to turn customs life in final destination into, well, hell or real problems. On top of that, the COVID crisis messes up a lot with the situation. I mean, it's trivial to say that COVID crisis was a big bang, was a sudden, big, and extremely profound change into the way economies function. And COVID crisis changed the landscape for everything, including illicit trade, right? Such factors as closing borders, lockdowns that imply closures of shops, rerouting of goods, disruption of trade routes, and also more focus on health and safety aspects. Such profound factors impact a lot modern economies. And of course, these changes are seen everywhere, right? Not only in illicit trade, but, well, also say in illicit trade. You might recall how impactful COVID crisis were for the containerized maritime transport, when the prices went up so high that we face problem with supply of daily products. And we see these impacts for car manufacturing or, you know, supply of daily goods. So these dominoes effects are everywhere. And we see also lots of problems in illicit trade. As Jeff Hardy said, illicit trade's problems were flamed by COVID crisis. That was just like a gas put on a fire. Where there were small problems, now they are exploding. And we see such effects as boom of abuse of small parcels and e-commerce. We see brand new trade routes of illicit trade. We also see big shift of criminals into illicit trade with substandard pharmaceuticals or products related to health and safety. And that poses additional problems. What was already a big problem now creates additional big risks and dangers for consumers' health and safety, right? So far, main focus was on, say, economic risks, risks related to good governance, criminal networks. Now, these risks become even bigger because, well, health is at risk, right? Earlier this year, we've seen already cases of illicit counterfeit COVID vaccines being traded around. These are huge problems. Next slide, please. So to address these problems, the OECD is able to issue some recommendations, some standards that will instruct key players in the trade area to, well, to work with us, to apply high standards of transparency, to avoid being abused by criminals in illicit trade. Our recommendations are non-binding, but these non-binding are still legal instruments, right? Legal instruments to be adhered by jurisdictions, by economies. We see these recommendations as fully complementary to existing frameworks. For example, the FTZ's recommendation we see as actually enhancing countries to adopt WCO's revised Kyoto Convention and to comply with its regulations. But our recommendations we see as, I would say, best standards developed with the industry, in partnership with industry, to define a set of standards that those parts of the industry that want to be clean can observe in order to avoid being abused by illicit trade. So the Free Trade Zone recommendation presents a set of norms, a set of, I would say, rules for free trade zones to be observed in order to be clean. And these days we are working on a certification mark for those free trade zones that really want to comply, that want to be within, I would say, the revised Kyoto Convention family and wants to work with us to counter illicit trade. I see that I have already exceeded my time a lot. My apologies for this. So next slide, please. So if there's any questions on our work, on our, well, future plans, do not hesitate to drop me a message, send me an email. I know my name is not the easiest one, but you can always ask Google for Piotr OECD. And once again, thank you so much. It's a pleasure being with you here.
Piotr, thank you very much for your interesting intervention. And now we are heading to the private sector. And the chair of BIAC's Anti-Illicit Trade Expert Group, Mr. David Luna. We are delighted to welcome Mr. David Luna, who is the CEO and president of Luna Global Networks and Convergence Strategies LLC, a global advisory consultancy. As chair of the BIAC Anti-Illicit Trade Expert Group, Mr. Luna oversees business at OECD's work on providing evidence-based and structured input to OECD activities on illicit trade. The expert group also provides business leadership and market insights through written comments on related OECD policy drafts, active participation in meetings of the OECD Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade, and relevant OECD conference. Mr. Luna, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nina. Good morning, good afternoon. It is an honor to be with you today for this important discussion. Let me applaud business at OECD and the Hellenic Federation of Enterprises for their leadership in jointly hosting this event. And I would also like to thank BIAC Executive Director Hani Rosenbaum and Alejandros Shakopoulos, the General Director of SEV, for their commitment and energies to bring together leaders from governments, business, civil society to take collective action to counter illicit trade. Let me also thank Piotr and Martin and their colleagues for their leadership as well in mobilizing member states on the ongoing work of the OECD to counter illicit trade globally, and their commitment to work with business at OECD on this important area. As was underscored during the opening statements, the pandemic in many cases has further accelerated illicit trade, especially across e-commerce and online marketplaces. Make no mistake, the global economy constitutes a staggering multi-trillion-dollar per year that enables kleptocrats to loot their countries, criminal organizations to co-opt states and export violence, and terrorist groups to finance or attacks against our society. Illicit trade and illicit economies are global phenomena. They don't stay contained within their borders. Greed and criminality spread and travel fast. If criminals can make money, they will do so and exploit every opportunity to do it. Illicit economies are pervasive threats that undermine democracy, corrode the rule of law, fuel impunity, and imperil the effective implementations of national sustainable economic development strategies. As we confront the significant harms and risks posed by illicit trade across today's global supply chains, to effectively counter illicit trade across borders, we must strengthen the political will and cross-sectoral cooperation through dynamic public-private partnerships. This includes not only targeted enforcement and information sharing to combat corrupt officials, criminal entrepreneurs, and complicit enablers that have infiltrated today's global supply chains. No one government, industry, or community alone can counter illicit trade. It is through collective action and partnerships that we can develop our networks to fight illicit networks. Next slide. This is what Business at OECD is doing, leading by example in advancing whole of society coalitions, such as the Anti-Illicit Trade Expert Group, across industry of leading industry and business leaders working closely with governments and civil society to not only advocate for open markets and private sector-led growth, but also to leverage resources, intelligence, capabilities, and capacities to disrupt, criminalize, and illegal trade and related corruption. Through our partnership with the Task Force on Counter Illicit Trade, we are working well together in supporting numerous webinars, reports, and related special projects. Next slide. Including the illicit trade challenges related to e-commerce and online marketplaces, phase 1 and phase 2. We heard a little bit about the free trade zones recommendation, and I would agree with Piotr, they truly are black holes of illicit trade, and we continue to work with governments, member states, the OECD, on the misuse of maritime transport, containerized shipping, for counterfeit trade, and the illicit trade in high-risk sectors. We must also increase, for example, how counterfeit medicines or personal protective equipment, illicit goods, and other contraband, such as fentanyl, can have a devastating effect on consumers and their communities. One of the great ways that Business at OECD Expert Group on Anti-Illicit Trade is cooperating with the OECD and the task force is through knowledge management and data empowerment, such as evidence-based research that Piotr just outlined earlier. Another way is for the anti-illicit group is providing leadership is by bringing together key market stakeholders as a force multiplier across strategic markets. And we will be doing this working with one of our partners, the U.S. Council for International Business and the IPR Center next week at the launch of the e-commerce report by the OECD. Finally, before getting to the last slide on our recommendations to OECD governments, it is important that we equally make the fight against corruption a priority, especially as we celebrate today International Anti-Corruption Day. We must address the corruptive influence of corruption that fuels illicit trade at our work at the OECD and Business at OECD. Earlier this week, I shared a Summit Democracy Civil Society event in Washington. In fact, President Biden just opened the plenary today in Washington. In that event, we also underscored how corruption and criminality really imperiled not only the democracy agenda, but our market, foreign direct investment, and economic development issues. I mention this because working on counter illicit trade is really a challenge, and sometimes we must really leverage our coalition of networks to do more together. So how do we do this in tackling spaces of illicitness that hampers our collective efforts? While I really don't have the answer, I think it is important that we continue to harness our energies to confront crime convergence in black markets. Finally, next slide. We will continue to work with governments at the OECD to further our important work. This includes making sure that we have financial resources to support the OECD Task Force on Counter Illicit Trade, to ensure that we develop a global illicit trade assessment report, to ensure and encourage member states to really fund national assessments, such as the UK, Switzerland, and Italy. We hope Greece and the United States can similarly do a national assessment. Again, I think cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary approaches are very important. And I do think that continued research and analytical papers such as the illicit trade and high-risk sectors are very important. And we must continue to leverage our network, including with partnerships with the G20, B20, APEC, the WTO, and Interpol. Again, I commend BIAC and SEV for their leadership in working and bringing us together to counter the illicit trade especially during the current pandemic and economic recovery. And I look forward to hearing from my colleague, LBC, who I have had the distinct honor of working in the Anti-Illicit Trade Expert Group and benefit from its wisdom, pragmatic business insights every day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Luna, for your presentation. Your recommendations are always food for thought. I would like now to welcome Mr. Alevizos Justiniani, the Vice Chair of Business at OECD Expert Group on Anti-Illicit Trade. He joined Philip Morris 20 years ago, and since 2015, he is the Vice President of Illicit Trade Prevention at Philip Morris International. Mr. Justiniani, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nineta. I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon to everybody, and also thank the BIAC hosting this event, but also the co-host, the Hellenic Federation of Enterprises. I do think and I value a lot these kind of events because it is an opportunity to share opinions and to continue to keep high the awareness and the fight of leaders against illicit trade. Let me start to answering a question, why does Philip Morris International care? Why do we care fighting illicit trade? It's a question which I think goes at the fundamental of what my team is leading. We care for different reasons, but let me just spell out three important reasons, the main reason. The first reason is because illicit trade impacts government revenues. There's the KPMG report on illicit trade in Europe. It's a report that's been financed by the industry since many, many years. And it shows that in 2020, the amount of revenues lost by the member states in Europe amounted to 8.5 billion euros. When it comes to Greece, it was in excess of €500 million. If you look at the world, 1 out of 10 cigarettes is an illegal cigarettes, and that is taking away from governments something like $50 billion of revenues. This is all money that the governments could use to build schools, infrastructures, and hospitals, especially in a moment like this where we have COVID. So that's really the first reason why we care, because it impacts governments. The second reason we care is because it impacts society and employment. More the illicit trade flourishes, the less the illicit trade can flourish and develop. So every job in the illicit trade is basically one job lost in the illicit trade. For example, in many countries in Europe as well, if you have illicit trade of cigarettes, the tobacconist, which is impacted, many clients has to close business. It just doesn't have the clients to come to the shop. So it is impacting society. It's really impacting employment. It's really impacting the everyday person, and that's the second reason why we care. The third reason, and actually maybe I should have mentioned this one as the first reason, is because it impacts consumers and impacts people. And very often these people are impacted and they are unwittingly buying illicit trade products. Nowadays, also due to COVID, the amount of traffic on e-commerce platforms, but also on social media, has dramatically increased. Many people buy products on these platforms because they trust the platform, and they look for a good bargain. And often the products that they buy are going to be counterfeit products because the illicit trade has infiltrated these platforms. So these consumers unwittingly are going to be ending up with a product which is inferior. It can be cigarettes, but it can also be a pharmaceutical product. It can be a toy for the kids. And therefore, the third reason why we care is because the illicit trade is impacting consumers and people in everyday activity. Coming to public-private partnership, it's been said already throughout the day, throughout this session, but I cannot insist in how important this is. You need a network to fight another network. Illicit trade is in the hands of organized crimes, and organized crimes are sophisticated organizations. The sophisticated organization that has ties with other organizations, other criminal organizations across the whole world. So they don't know borders. They don't specialize on a product, but they actually specialize on many products, any product that they can make money. So you need really a network to fight this network. Nobody alone, be it a private sector, be it a government, be it an NGO, can actually succeed. But together as a network, I do think we have a chance of succeeding. And this public-private partnership, I think, is fundamental in order to exchange information, to exchange knowledge, training, and also resources. We are very proud in Philip Morris that in 2021, at the beginning of this year, we signed an MOU with the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. You know, this is a very important department. It is a umbrella department that is heading many agencies in the United States. So it's an extremely powerful, important department, which not only has an influence in the United States, but also beyond, because this Department of Homeland Security has also agency around the world. Therefore, I think it's an extremely important MOU we signed in order to fight illicit trade, not only in the United States, but across the world. This is just one of the examples. Public-private partnership goes in many shapes and forms. Working for Philip Morris for many years, I am very proud that in 2016, we launched a program called PMI Impact. PMI Impact is an initiative that pledged $100 million to finance projects coming from the public and private sector in order to fight illicit trade. So far, we have awarded grants to 60 projects around 30 countries in the world for a total of roughly $50 million. So we're halfway through. Actually very pleased to be here today and with the Greek colleagues and with Mr. Anagnotopoulos. I'm sure I pronounced the name wrongly, because representing the institution in Greece, we have extremely good partnerships with the institutions in Greece. The Hellenic Coast Guard was one of the awardees. They presented a project some years ago, and they won a grant from PMI Impact, and we sponsored 5 speedboats to control part of the Hellenic coast, which is a very extremely large body of water to control. So that's one example of a partnership we have with the Greek institution, but also we provided scanners some years ago. But we also exchange information, and I'm very proud of the work that the Greeks are doing. This year saw Greece doing the biggest seizure on cigarette in all Europe that I recall of. It was 338 million cigarettes. Just to give you the proportion, that is around more than 30 containers. And 30 containers of illicit product, that makes a dent in the illicit producer shipping those products. Greece also raided a year ago the biggest factory in Europe, which is really impressive. If you have a chance to see the footage, it's really a huge factory. So I'm really proud with the cooperation we have with the Greek authorities in different shipping forms in really to fight illicit trade. And right now, I think in these days, we're doing an awareness campaign with the Greek authorities in order to increase the awareness of how illicit trade is connected to organized crime among the overall population. So public-private partnership is fundamental. I'm very happy that we partner with BIAC and indirectly with the OECD. This is an extremely valuable partnership. Piotr clearly highlighted the work that OECD is doing, and so in areas which are very to the heart of the interest we have as well in free trade zones, which is an important element to foster economy around the world, but it also can be misused and abused by the organized crimes. So I think I value a lot of that work we're doing with the OECD and the partnership we have via BIAC in that front. I'll stop it there in the interest of time, and I'll give back the mic to Ninetta. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your intervention. You gave us a full overview of the problem and pointed out the fundamental importance of the private and public partnership to fight illicit trade. Now, I would like to welcome Mr. Sotirios Anagnosopoulos, General Secretary of Commerce and Consumer Protection, Ministry of Development and Investments at the Government of the Hellenic Republic. Mr. Anagnosopoulos is a civil engineer, and since October of 2019, he has worked as a scientific associate of the Secretary General of Commerce and Consumer Protection. From this position, Mr. Anagnosopoulos participated in several working groups on the responsibilities of the relevant General Secretariat. Mr. Anagnosopoulos, please, the floor is yours.
Honorable officials of the OECD and SEV, panelists and guests, I would like to thank you for the invitation to participate in this very interesting virtual conference concerning the evolution of illicit trade during the current pandemic crisis of COVID-19. It is a great opportunity for me, as a representative of the Greek government, to highlight some of the most important aspects of this issue from the perspective of our country. Illicit trade can take a number of different forms, including the production and distribution of counterfeit products, tax and tariff evasion, and the trade of contraband products. All of this form of illicit trade have an adverse impact on economic stability, on social welfare, on public health and safety, as well as on the environment. Obviously, illicit trade of goods such as fuel, alcohol, and tobacco products has a detrimental effect on the economy, since taxes and tariffs avoidance leads to a significant loss of income for the government and deprives the state of the financial capacity to fund activities that enhance public services such as health and education. Moreover, the illicit trade of such goods is linked to the avoidance of quality controls of the products that are intended for public consumption, thus creating major risks for public safety and property as well as for public health. A very important aspect of illicit trade, which is of particular interest for the General Secretariat for Commerce and Consumer Protection, is the trade of counterfeit goods, meaning the trade of goods often of inferior quality, made or sold under another's brand name without the brand owner authorization. Counterfeit products exist in virtually every industry sector, including food, beverages, apparel, accessories, footwear, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, electronics, auto parts, and toys. And counterfeiting is a very lucrative business of a relatively low risk and high profit margins. It is important to underline that the illicit trade of counterfeit goods market amounts to about $2 trillion per year, which is larger than the drug and human trafficking markets, which are considered to be more risky. Counterfeit products trade is popular because of two main reasons: a high demand for brand goods by the average consumer and a favorable profit per risk ratio for the illicit traders and the manufacturers of counterfeit products. Understanding these two reasons is essential in order to form a strategy for combating illicit trade of counterfeit goods. An important aspect that has to be taken under consideration is that the pandemic of COVID-19 has led to a rise of online purchases and the gradual shift from brick and mortar stores to online shopping, even directly through social media. This means that illicit trade has created even more inroads to the Greek market, exploiting the fact that the consumers shifted to a digital but much less regulated environment. A sound strategy for combating illicit trade is, of course, increasing the risk of the counterfeiting business, thus making it less profitable for all actors in the counterfeit products supply chain. The strategy obviously includes enhancing the capacity of government institutions such as police, customs, coast guard, and special units that are dedicated to combating illicit trade. To this end, Greece has made significant progress in the last 2 years and aspires to make an even greater progress in the future. It is well known that Greece is the member state of the European Union that is geographically closer than any other to third countries that mass produce and distribute counterfeit products. Additionally, Greece has a total of about 1,000 kilometers of land frontiers and a coastline of 15,000 kilometers and a large number of ports that can be used for commercial purposes. As such, Greece is a potential gateway for illicitly traded goods in Europe, and thus it has to undertake a large burden, much larger than almost any other European member state, in order to effectively guard its borders, which are also the European borders, against illicit trade actions. One of the highlights of the progress Greece has made in this sector is the creation of DIMEA, a new agency that operates by the side of the General Secretariat for Commerce and Consumer Protection. The new agency was created by the provisions of the law 4712 of 2020 and has replaced the old CKA board as well as the obsolete and cumbersome mechanism of Directorate for Market Controls. One of its aims is to operate in the field combating all forms of illegal trade in the Greek internal market, including the illicit trade of counterfeit goods in brick-and-mortar establishments, as well as on the internet and social media e-shops. Another important aim of DIMEA is to coordinate all regional market control agencies assisted by the police and the municipal police in order to target and enhance controls for counterfeit goods. Additionally, DIMEA is tasked with providing guidance and training to other control authorities and enhancing their enforcement capacities. DIMEA's first 15 months of operation have yielded impressive results. Even though DIMEA is comprised by a relatively small number of control agents, it has achieved to perform about 30,000 controls concerning illegal trade, spotting more than 2,000 violations, resulting to infringement fines of more than 2.5 million euros, and leading to the confiscation of more than 130,000 counterfeit product units. Additionally, DIMEA has also made significant progress in combating illicit trade of counterfeit products on the internet, and more specifically against e-shops, spotting more than 100 violations and applying more than 700,000 euros in fines, and destroying more than 100,000 counterfeit product units. Also, more than 30 e-shops were discontinued by deleting their URL addresses for offering counterfeit products to consumers. It is also worth mentioning that according to the latest EU IPO report of November 2021, Greece was the member state that demonstrated the greatest estimated value of detained counterfeit goods for the year 2020. DIMEA's capabilities are going to be further enhanced by the enaction of a new project funded by the Recovery and Resilience Fund. The value of the project will amount to more than 16 million euros on acquiring more permanent control stations across the internal road network of all Greece, the procurement of new mobile X-ray scanners that will be able to reveal counterfeit products while being transported, specialized training programs, the creation of a modern center of operations, and the acquisition of specialized software. However, another good strategy for tackling illicit trade is to address the other part of the illicit trade equation, demand for counterfeit goods. And I believe that this strategy has yet to flourish and must be given more attention in the future. A high demand for brand goods at a very affordable price is always an enticing option for the average consumer. The average consumer feels that purchasing a counterfeit product will give him the opportunity to possess a good that is a close resemblance to the original brand good without having to compromise much in terms of quality and certainly much less in terms of financial resources. Of course, this view is distorted and well far from the truth. Counterfeit goods producers make large compromises in terms of quality exactly because this low quality would only potentially harm another company's brand, not theirs. They do not have to defend their brand and have every reason to cut on the production costs in order to maximize their profits. The profit maximization for counterfeit product manufacturers, distributors, and sellers leads, however, to a much greater reduction of total social welfare. For instance, counterfeit clothes, shoes, or electronic devices can be dangerous for the consumer's health, leading to the issues that require much costlier medical care and have an adverse effect on the quality of the consumer's lives. It is important to stress that during the current pandemic of COVID-19, and especially during the initial stages when the world was not yet ready to face it properly, counterfeit products trade also expanded to goods where the market suffered temporary shortages, such as in the market for medical masks and antibacterial chemical substances. It is probably needless to explain the dangers that come from using a medical mask or an antiseptic of inadequate quality while such a dangerous disease was spreading rapidly. On the other hand, illicit trade makes brand companies to be less motivated to continue to produce goods of improved quality or to defend their brands, thus hampering growth, innovation, competitiveness, competition, and business. This lower motivation results in less choice for the consumer and the consumption of poorer quality products in the long run. We have all witnessed this truth in the audiovisual industry, where online piracy and unlicensed streaming led to lower quality audiovisual products for a long time, until the new online streaming giants have emerged, bringing a revolution to the corresponding industry. Therefore, a strategy that aims to reduce the demand for counterfeit products by informing the consumers about this reality makes sense. And this, I believe, should also be an important part of the Greek strategy for combating illicit trade. An informed consumer that is sensitive towards matters of intellectual property protection, and a consumer who understands that counterfeit products undermine his quality of life, is a consumer that is much less prone to purchasing illicit goods. But adequately and effectively informing the consumers is a complicated and costly task, which demands constant effort and perseverance in order to bear fruit. Both strategies, increasing the risk-to-profit ratio for illicit trade and reducing demand, necessitate a close cooperation between the public and private sector. The state control and enforcement authorities, namely the police, customs, the Coast Guard, and special inspection bodies such as DMEA, possess a growing but still limited capacity to efficiently tackle illicit trade on their own. The private sector, and more specifically the companies that aim to defend their intellectual property and brands, can always help the authorities by providing more resources to the authorities, such as specialized equipment and training, providing targeted information and methods of recognition of counterfeit products, contributing to consumer information campaigns in cooperation with the public authorities that will target specific audiences that are more prone to purchase counterfeit products, and being more socially responsible towards the public, thus showing the consumers that their increased welfare has positive spillover effects in their own quality of life. Closing my intervention, I would like to thank you again for the invitation to participate in this conference and to reassure you that the Greek government is willing to increase its efforts in combating illicit trade, aiming to exploit all available aid by the private sector and cross-border cooperations. Thank you very much.
Mr. Anaklostopoulos, thank you very much for your intervention. The case of Greece is always very interesting, and your initiative certainly will have a positive impact during these times. We move on now to our last panel, and we welcome Mr. Maurice Adefalou, Technical Officer, IPR and Health and Safety Program Manager in World Customs Organization. Mr. Adefalou joined the Organization of World Customs in July 2019, and before that had a 13-year career in various positions at Benin Customs. Mr. Adefalou, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Can you see my screen also?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to join this event, and thank for the organizer. Yes, and yeah, this event is very relevant, timely event as we are in this COVID-19 pandemic. And from the WCO, it's a pleasure for us to share what we saw and what we are seeing during this COVID-19 pandemic, especially regarding the illicit trade. Just for the background of the audience, we are the World Customs Organization with 183 members. Our daily working is to help custom administration in how they can harmonize the custom process. We are working closely with them to set up relevant tools and instruments on how they can facilitate the trade, but in the same time, how they can control. My colleague Piotr talked about the RKC tool, an instrument who is one of relevant tools in the trade. Okay, our strategy plan is based on our goal, on how we can help the members, trade facilitation, revenue connection, protection of the society, and for the 3 last year until 2022, our strategic plan is based on 9 priorities. As I said, provide leadership, guidance, and support custom administration. But as we start with the COVID-19 situation, and based on the member request, the Secretariat of the WCO, we develop another dedicated COVID-19 action plan, which is now our top priority in the organization. This COVID-19 action plan is based on some measures adopted in the WCO Council resolutions. And we have 25 specific actions to be conducted from January 2021 to June 2022. And the main idea is first to help custom administration on how they can facilitate the legitimate trade during this COVID-19 time. As you may be aware, at the beginning, several countries, they block their country, they block the ports, they cannot work, they block the airport. But in the meantime, we need to have the release good, we need to have the good, we need to have medical equipment and other goods for the population. It's why first we work closely with our member, with the best practice, with our guidance, instrument and tool on how they can deal in this critical situation. Is the work we did regarding the facilitation side to mitigate the pandemic effect with our member. But in other side, we received several alerts from our member at the beginning of the pandemic and when we have the lockdown, that the criminal organization, they are taking the COVID-19 pandemic into opportunity for their bad activity. It's why in the same time we take action to control, especially the good, the medical equipment, the medicine and other vaccine linked to COVID-19. And it's why in last year, in April, we launched the first operation, namely Stop 1 operation with 99 custom administration, international organization, and the private sectors. The aim of this operation is to help our members to stop illicit, counterfeit, substandard medical equipment and medical goods linked to COVID-19. And the result was impressed. It's not, as the previous speaker said, it's not a little amount or a little quantity of goods. As we says, more than 300 million illicit medicine around the world, 47 million medical equipment, mask, face mask, COVID-19 trees, and other medical equipment. And it was a great operation as we can work together first with the private sector and other international organizations like Interpol, Europol, Olaf, but also with the pharma company. And as when we complete the first operation, the vaccine linked to COVID-19 was not yet approved. It's why we took action for another operation. But let me quick back on what Piotr shared with you regarding the challenges for custom now in this critical time regarding the small parcel e-commerce. We see several medicine, medical equipment linked to the COVID-19 in small parcel at post, and more e-commerce remain a challenge for custom. And as I said, as soon we got the approval of the vaccine around the world by World Health Organization, we set up in this year, from April to September, the second operation, namely Stop 2 operation, which is the second response from the WCO against the illegal trafficking linked to COVID-19 vaccine, medicine, and you can see in my screen, we never have this kind of operation in WCO with 146 members, custom administration who take a part in this operation. It was, as I said in my training at other conference, it was a marathon because coordinate 146 custom administration. It was not an easy task, but we did it. And we have 83 members who report cases. More than 2,000 cases were reported, with more than 3,000 Caesar cases in this second operation. Regarding the medicines, it's more than nearly 200 million medicine who are seized, and also medical equipment. But the hook here, the main point is the COVID-19 vaccine. We say more than 13 million COVID-19 doses of COVID-19 vaccine, which mostly don't have the requirement authorization or don't have the health authority approval. That is the outcome of stop 2 operation, and we launched this week, last Tuesday, the report of the operation. I can provide you with some executive summary of the operation with the organizer. That is quickly a short background on what we said during COVID-19. Here you can see some vaccine who are seized in small parcels, but also other trends we saw, like the anti-parasitic medicine, like ivermectin, which is the most, several quantity, a huge quantity, we says, in small parcels, but also in other commodity during this operation. We saw other trends like the COVID-19 record vaccination card, which was sold by several members like US during this campaign, but also some oxygen medical device, but oxygen cylinder also. As you may know, oxygen is very important for the medicines in the hospital, but this need to be controlled by the government. Unfortunately, some criminals took this in opportunity to make some traffic, and we saw several cases of oxygen devices, oxygen cylinder during these operations. Okay, cooperation is the key of the success of this operation, and cooperation first with the international organization like World Health Organization, OLAF, Interpol, UNODC, and Europol, who take part in this operation. If I can talk regarding our cooperation with World Health Organization, prior and during the operation, we have several training with the custom administration, and they can give us their insights on how they can improve their knowledge regarding these challenges. But last but not least, for the cooperation is the great cooperation we have with the pharmaceutical company who produced COVID-19 vaccine. And we held more than 15 series of a webinar with Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, and Sinopharm, which nearly 2,000 participants in this webinar to train custom on how they can make distinction between genuine and fake vaccine. This was a very interesting training webinar with the custom administration. That is shortly what we did. And as the COVID is still ongoing, and as we will have shortly, there are some countries who approved already some medicine to cure COVID-19 vaccine. We will continue to train custom, but also to have another operation in the upcoming month. Our next step will be a global webinar with MSD, which medicine is already approved in UK. And we will have other webinar to update our custom administration, our national contact points on how we can deal in this critical time. That is shortly what I can share with you regarding the role of the World Customs Organization on how, in first hand, we can facilitate the circulation of the good, but in other hand, we need to stop the illegitimate trade, which can be a danger for the society. Thank you very much for your attention, and happy to hear from you, your comments and your questions.
Mr. Adefalou, thank you very much for your analysis on the role of World Customs Organization and the effective stop operation. It was really interesting. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Mr. Jeff Hardy, Director General of the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, TRACE-IT. Jeff Hardy is a seasoned executive with 25 years experience, strengthening the voice of business in international policy. Before joining TRACE-IT, he served as the director of the International Chamber of Commerce, Business Action to Stop Counterfeiting and Piracy, where he particularly focused on engaging with the business community to fight illicit trade in the forms of trademark counterfeiting and copyright piracy. Mr. Hardy, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ninetta. It's a real pleasure to be here and to join everyone. There's been some terrific presentations today, and I'll try not to repeat too many of those things. In fact, I was thinking as the program played out that I really wanted to concentrate perhaps on two of what I think are the most important lessons learned during the pandemic. But let me start by saying I think, this event is very timely. All of you are probably just like me and my family. We're grappling with, returning to work, returning to school, adjusting to limited travel, all those negative externalities from the pandemic. And meanwhile, while we keep thinking it's going to get closer to ending, we see that the virus is surging in some countries and states. So it's a very difficult situation we're in, and I appreciate you holding this timely workshop. What I thought I'd do is really just start off by talking about, what I think, just looking at this in the big picture. I mean, and what we're looking at is really what kind of impact has the pandemic had on demand and supply dynamics? I think that's really where we're going to find our solutions in the end. And when I talk about demand, what I mean is, at the early days of the pandemic, at least, and Maurice was touching on these earlier, is we were looking at fear and need-based demand. Fear demand for face masks, or a new acronym we learned, PPEs, personal protection equipment, fear demand for remedies, needs demand for, products to support our life at home, like workout equipment or bicycles or electronic communications products. We also, during the pandemic, we also saw a lot of, supply dynamics where fakes were offered online, flooding online, really, to feed the fear-driven demand. I mean, the WCO was one of the early leaders here of creating, I think you created, Maurice, a landing page there at the WCO with every bit of possible information that could be found on the PPEs, the fake remedies, efforts that customs were trying to take worldwide to stop it. And then I think what we see right now is the lagging impact, I guess, of the demand of the pandemic on the supply chain. I think, I've heard a couple of speakers talk about supply shortages. We've seen news articles and news stories about the supply chain and maritime shipping and the delays at ports. And I think it's exposing consumers to things they didn't really even understand before about how a product gets from one place to another. But the long story short there is that when demand surges past supply, there's an opportunity for market entry. And that's really what we need to guard against now is, preventing illicit suppliers from entering the supply chain and from increasing their market share. I think that really is job one. The legitimate industries have been sidelined for so long, and the illicit traders are filling those gaps. So at the beginning of this, Ninetta asked me for a quote, sort of describe what I wanted to say today. And I told her the pandemic has shown all of us that the world is woefully unprepared to slow illicit trade, let alone stop it. And I think that's, for me at least, that's what's driving our work at TRACE-IT and for our member companies. So what I'd like to do is just in a few minutes talk about two examples to help sort of elucidate what I'm talking about right now. That's going to be e-commerce, and then some problems in high-risk sectors, things, the terminology the OECD used. What we saw some impacts in tobacco and alcoholic beverages during the pandemic. Let's talk about e-commerce for a second. Most of us that have been in this area know that there was already a flood of fakes online. This was already a major problem fighting counterfeiting as it shifted from physical sales of counterfeits to online distribution. So this was something we were already grappling with. Then the pandemic hit. And what do we see? We saw a surge. Let's take face masks, for example, 2,000% increase in the online ability of fake face masks. All of this documented by WCO, Interpol, the US Customs and Border Protection. And then there was a surge in online fakes for all those goodies that I was talking about before that we all needed during lockdown, like home workout equipment, right? Or electronic communications equipment. So that was a trend that we were already dealing with that was amplified during the pandemic. Then there's another trend, right? There was this trend that we were all talking about, how e-commerce, online shopping was growing and growing and growing in all regions worldwide. The United States, North America certainly was experiencing a lot of growth, but Southeast Asia, for example, was leading those numbers, and it was giving market analysts, a challenge to predict, how fast, how would this shift go from brick and mortar stores to online shopping? Well, the pandemic provided us a sneak preview into that, where, online shopping went from 20% of markets to 60% of markets in some countries. I mean, it doubled and tripled. And you saw shoppers, like my mom and dad, for example, who may not have normally shopped online, who may not have experiences in protecting themselves from fraud or fighting counterfeits, were all going online. It was a sneak peek into the future. And those two trends, to me, added up to the fact that, again, we are not prepared. We weren't prepared before to keep fakes and illicit products offline, and we certainly aren't prepared now with more shoppers and more fake products entering the marketplace. So we need stronger rules. We need better rules. We're going to need to get back to the basics. I mean, there's some good legislation in the United States and in Brussels, in Europe, that are trying to tackle this problem. My organization, our member companies, have certainly been behind those lawmakers trying to introduce new rules. I'll leave you with two priorities that I think we want to see happen. One is we'd like to see a business license for every seller online. I don't know about the countries that are all on today's conference call, but in the United States, you need a business license to sell anything or to conduct any kind of business. And I see no reason why that shouldn't be part of our future commercial activity by licensing any seller. I also think there need to be better rules on liability and penalties for intermediaries who do not adequately secure their platforms, their infrastructures. The time has passed for us to look the other way. We need new, stronger rules, and I'm hoping when the pandemic settles down a little bit, the lawmakers can address this and make this a priority. The second thing I want to talk about is what we observed during the pandemic in terms of illicit sales in tobacco products and alcoholic beverages. This was really, from an economic and policy standpoint, a fascinating train wreck that we observed during the worst part of the pandemic. And understandably, we knew that governments around the world were grappling with measures to try to implement social distancing and to try to stem the effects of the virus. No one knew how to go about doing this. We were all looking for solutions. Unfortunately, some of the solutions that emerged from this mixed bag of policy measures were very strict restrictions on tobacco products and alcoholic beverages. And I think, you know, going back to the point that I was making at the very beginning, we all know what happens when supply is restricted. It opens the door for substitute products. And in the case of alcohol or tobacco, substitutes already existed, and they already existed in very significant percentages. In fact, in Latin and South America, for example, some of the markets for illicit alcohol were as much as 25% of the legal markets. So the government imposed restrictions during the pandemic on alcohol, for example, just opened the door for criminal organizations who are already supplying markets with illicit alcohol. In fact, the problem was so big that TRACEIT undertook a study, a report. Some of you may have seen that. It was called Prohibition, Illicit Alcohol, and Lessons Learned from Lockdown. You know, and what we found were that these well-intentioned but misconceived prohibition policies generated a number, well, too many, really, negative externalities on society and economy. And in our view, I think the main conclusion of our report that these measures were just a step too far. Most of the evidence in this report, and it's really of interest, we did a webinar early in the year with OECD on this. Info's on our website, traceit.org. But we looked closely at Panama, South Africa, and India, where the negative impacts were the worst, where the health impacts were the worst, where the death toll, I think collectively and worldwide, reached as many as 1,000 by the time that we published the report. But we also had found evidence of surges in illicit alcohol in 20 other countries worldwide that were under these government-imposed restrictions. I'm not going to go into the whole thing. I'll leave you with 4 lessons learned that we took away from that, and that these prohibition restrictions incentivized illicit markets and criminal activity. It triggered serious health risks and deaths. It reduced the tax collections at a time really when governments needed that income the most, and it sidelined legitimate business. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk about this. I was pleased to see some of the governments sort of change their policy in response to some of these externalities. So let me close by saying, really, it's time to get back to basics. We were fighting illicit trade before the pandemic. We had to struggle to fight it during, which we still are. And we need to get back to basics after the pandemic. And that means getting back to our focus on law enforcement and policing illicit trade, getting back to basics on strengthening deterrent criminal penalties, strengthening the custom environment and border control. I mean, talk about a lesson there on border control. Customs rose to the occasion worldwide on protecting borders, not just for the passage of people to prevent the virus, but the passage of products. And what we saw was amazing results. And it's been my hope that, boy, if customs could continue to focus on prioritize counterfeits and illicits crossing border after the pandemic, then that would be a major step toward ending illicit trade. But we also need tighter controls on money laundering and corruption and strengthening intellectual property rights. It's a long list of things we need to do, things we were all working on at the OECD, in Greece, at TRACEIT. And I just hope that we can, rechannel and increase our resources going forward. So Ninetta, that's really what I had to say today. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy, for your qualitative analysis and the interesting points you highlighted. Our speakers now have just completed their intervention, and we move on to the interactive part of the conference. As I mentioned in the beginning, you can pose your question on the chat box. Please don't hesitate to ask our expert speakers and begin a fruitful discussion. Let's start the Q&A session. Piotr, I have two questions for you to answer on behalf of OECD perspective. During your intervention, apart from free trade zones you mentioned, what are the other areas where the task force could work together with the industry on standards to enhance transparency? Thank you very much, Piotr. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's an excellent question. And actually, let me recall that all our areas of work with industry are not just picked from the sky, right? We select these areas based on our work on evidence. And our work on evidence firstly pointed at the problems that some free trade zones might pose. But not only free trade zones are within our scope of interest, right? So other areas that you ask about include, of course, containerized maritime transport. That's one. Another one is our work on e-commerce and e-commerce platforms. Next area are small parcels and small parcels providers. In all these areas, there are some players that do not observe the rules. And these players create, I would say, some market failure opportunities for the whole sectors. What is our ambition here is to work together with industry, with those clean parts of the industry, with those that want to counter illicit trade, be it containerized maritime providers, be it online platforms, be it small parcels operators, to look what are the criteria that tell good actors from bad actors in these areas, right? And how OECD can help these good actors identify themselves on the market saying, we are good, actually. We want to promote illicit trade. We don't want really to make the contraband passing through the borders. This is our mission.
Thank you very much. I have another question for you. One of ΣΕΒ members would like to understand if OECD is assessing the possibility to extend its database for future research so that they provide a more complete overview of the involving illegal activities. Thank you again, Piotr. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a very good question. Short answer, yes. Data are the key when assessing illicit trade. And we really work very closely with our enforcement partners to make the data as complete as possible. And once again, thank you to WCO for being with us on that challenge. However, as I said, enforcement data are not census data, are not data on labor statistics. And there is lots of effort needed really to answer even the simplest question on illicit trade with these data. So answer is yes, we want to extract all these data as much as possible, but this is not an easy task. This is a very laborious task.
Thank you very much, Piotr. I will continue with Mr. David Luna. Illicit trade is a global phenomenon, and the work you have done certainly offers a global platform to disseminate best practices in a coordinated way. You share the view that effective and good transnational relations are of utmost importance to tackling it. But what happens when one state declares its willingness to cooperate with a neighboring state, while the other country shows a lesser degree of ambition? From your experience, how could one move ahead in a constructive way should such a case arise? Thank you very much, Mr. Luna. The floor is yours.
Ineta, thank you very much for the question. As a former diplomat, having worked on fighting corruption and organized crime for many years, for 25 years, it is a hard challenge. It's a hard challenge. This work on countering illicit trade is difficult. This is why, as Piotr was mentioning, this collective action using evidence-based research becomes very important. Look, if you look at some of the vectors, if you will, related to Greece, it's not so much the environment in Greece, it's really the surrounding, the cross currents, including the economies from the Balkans, you got the Black Sea, the Middle East, North Africa, Eurasia. There's a whole illicit trafficking corridor related to alcohol, tobacco, synthetic, human, the heroin, the Captagon from Syria and Lebanon. It just really compounds and creates, you know, a bigger threat altogether. And this is why I think this cross-border cooperation becomes very critical. And you know, I was pleased to hear the government of Greece underscore that they have a new action plan. So I applaud not only the government of Greece, but really working with the private sector, because again, it takes this network to fight networks, as LVC underscored. So on the political pressure, you know, this is why, you know, United, you know, bringing in our capabilities, our energies, our capacities, we can work to support and help Greece to counter not only the regional illicit trade, but more globally in places that create some of the counterfeiting or some of the contraband across different illicit trafficking hubs. So thank you for the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Luna. I will continue with Mr. Anagnostopoulos. During your intervention, you gave us an overview on how consumers are affected by illicit trade during the pandemic. Does the Greek Ministry of Development and Investments see value in plans to inform consumers on the multiple effects of illicit trade? And are you designing any related initiatives? How, in your view, can we enhance trust between consumers, enterprises, and the state? Thank you very much, Mr. Anagnostopoulos. The floor is yours.
Thank you for your question. Indeed, as I mentioned during my intervention, informing consumers on the multiple adverse effects of illicit trade on their quality of life should be one of the two main strategies that the Greek state has to employ in order to combat illicit trade by reducing the demand for illicit goods. To this end, the General Secretariat for Commerce and Consumer Protection is currently cooperating with the private sector in order to enhance the capacity of its enforcement agency, DIMEA. But we aim to expand our cooperation by launching cooperative informative campaigns along with the affected private firms in order to inform the consumers about the real cost of illicit trade for the society and for the individual consumer. But as you mentioned, a successful informative campaign should aim in create trust between consumers, enterprises, and the state. Consumers that opt to intentionally purchase a counterfeit product are urged to make this choice by the belief that an original copy of the same good is highly overpriced and that the counterfeit good offers an acceptable alternative which saves the consumer money without making significant compromises in terms of quality. This sentiment of overpricing hides a deficit of trust by the consumer towards the brand of the original product. The consumer also traditionally maintains a distrustful stance against the state and its willingness and capacity to effectively defend consumer rights. And this is something that we are currently trying to change by being more open to the consumer and by advertising as much as possible our regulatory actions, legislation, and fines for enhancing consumer protection. So how can we enhance trust between consumers, enterprises, and the state? Obviously, by explaining to everyone why the consumer is multiply benefited by purchasing original goods, by protecting his own health and safety, by enjoying much better quality, and by protecting the society that he lives in. The consumer must be given examples on how the illicit trade hurts innovation, competition, and job creation, and on the other hand, how lawful commerce enhances the national economy's capacity to produce more, to innovate, and to provide more and better jobs to everyone. In other words, the consumer will trust the private firms and the state more when he realizes that his personal interest aligns with the interest of lawful businesses and the state. And that is the message that we have to pass. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anagnostopoulos. I hope that these initiatives will be effective on consumers' behavior. Mr. Adefalou, this is your turn. Based on your experience during the past 2 years, has digitalization helped customs procedures to enforce social distancing requirements during outbreaks of infectious diseases, such as COVID-19? Does this trend towards digitalization offer any other opportunities to the authorities that they could take advantage of? Thank you very much. Mr. Adefalou, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very interesting question. Yes, the role of the custom now is, as I said in my intervention, is to facilitate the trade, and more custom administration are working with the WCO support to have a digitalization in our whole process. By example, and to be short, under the COVID-19 project, this is one of the projects launched by the WCO and funded by the Japan Customs Administration. To help this COVID-19 project, one of the components is to provide for some development country some IT tool which can help them on the clearance process without any contact during this COVID-19 pandemic, without any contact between the private sector and the custom officer. And I think that is a very good point, as several countries will receive this equipment regarding the digitalization process. But also the digitalization can help us to build a strong risk management, risk analysis on how we can maybe learn more on the data and make some policy recommendation for the authority, for the national authority. This is one of the new topic we are working on now. And I think each year we have a team of the custom administration, the whole world. And the next year we will work on the custom digitalization and also the data analysis. This will be our main topic. And regarding digitalization and for stop operation, when custom have Caesar, they need to go back on the field or on when they found some infringement on the field, they need to go back on the headquarters or in the office and to report in timely manner in the IPS income. The tool we build to exchange information among custom administration around the world. But we make a lot of improvement in this tool, like a mobile version of this tool, which can allow custom officials in the field to report Caesar in timely manner without any contact with other colleagues, and especially during this COVID-19 time, where social distance and other important information need to be respected. It's what I can share with you regarding digitalization, which is now our priority in the WCO and for custom administration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Radefalou. I think that it seems technology helps your work, and it is a very interesting and effective tool. So, Mr. Hardy, you mentioned in your speech that one of the industries affected during the pandemic was the alcoholic beverages industry. Indeed, illicit trade in alcohol encompasses a wide variety of illegal activity. How is Tracy dealing with this situation? And based on your experience, what initiatives should companies focus on as we move ahead? Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Nanetta, and thanks again for hosting this event. Yeah, I mentioned the report that we did on alcohol. The objective of that report was to reveal the true costs. I think someone was talking, or just a few minutes ago, maybe that was Piotr, was talking about the true costs of illicit trade. And that was the underlying objective of that report, was to show what are those negative externalities on health, on organized crime, on illicit market growth, on lost tax revenues, things like that, and to help governments understand the effectiveness of their policies. In this case, we were pointing out how certain pandemic policies were counterproductive. But overall, what we're trying to achieve is the body of knowledge and the rationale to help governments understand why they need to prioritize illicit trade. And that was the ultimate objective of that report. But that could be said not just for the alcohol sector, but for tobacco, for pesticides, for pharmaceuticals, for petroleum, illegal timber, and the list goes on. And that's where we want to work in the future. And I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to mention 3 pieces of work that we've done in the last year or so to try to help governments understand the true cost of illicit trade. And that was a study that we did on the negative impacts on governments achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, how illicit trade is slowing that progress and increasing the costs, how illicit trade can undermine government's sovereign credit ratings and thereby their ability to track investment, and a report that we recently published on the use of forced labor in illicit trade. And the reason we're doing that is because we want to show the true costs. It's not just the economic cost, but it's the costs on society and the people in society, whether it's the consumers, the workers, the investors. So it's my hope that the work that we do can be combined with, for example, the work that the OECD is doing. You saw in Martin's presentation, I think earlier, the prolific number of reports that the OECD has done to edify, the economic cost of the situation. I think taken together, these types of messages can help stop illicit trade. So we're committed to do that going forward. And my last comment, I want to do a plug for the AITEG at Business at OECD. Some of us are already members there. There's some great work that's being done. So any of you that haven't joined that group, contact the OECD or Mr. Luna, who's on my right corner of the screen, and come join us and help us against illicit trade.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hardy. As far as I can see, there are no questions in the chat, and I know that we have exceeded our time frame. So is there any participant that is willing to ask a question now? Otherwise, I will give the floor to Mr. Luna for our last session to share with us the lessons we learned from the pandemic and some recommendation for next steps for businesses, governments, and consumers that should undertake. Please, if is anybody from the participant that would like to ask, please feel free. So I can see it's a question for Mr. Hardy. Did you suggest a business license to sell online? Can you give some examples of better rules to avoid illicit trade? Would you please, Mr. Hardy, would you like to repeat the question?
No, I understand. I mean, I did mention the business license. I think a lot of the main provisions of some of the legislation in the US and Europe are looking at greater transparency and understanding who is selling these products or making these fake products available, which is a little bit different than the old way of looking at what's available online, trying to chase, millions of fake listings once they're already loose on the internet. The new approach is, if we can do a better job of identifying those rogue sellers, thousands of rogue sellers are responsible for millions, if not hundreds of millions of listings. So we see that as that legislation as a choke point in keeping the vast majority of the fake listings offline. Tracit's view is that we should go one step further on that. I don't think all the burden should fall on the platforms themselves. There's certainly a lot more they can do, and that legislation will help them, give them some guidelines on what they can do better. But I think there's also a role for governments and intergovernmental agencies, to create a registry, a business license, and require people to have a license before they sell online. Thank you.
You're on mute, Nineta. You're muted.
Sorry for that. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Mr. Hardy. As far as I can see, there are no other questions, so we can give the floor to Mr. Luna to make a summary of what we heard and what he suggests for recommendation for next steps. Mr. Luna, we are all ears. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nineta, and thank you for doing an outstanding job in moderating this webinar today. Well, from the inspiring words of our opening plenary, Hani and Alexandros, on the importance of working together towards that collective action, the importance of public-private partnership to counter the illicit trade. You know, this was a very difficult threat pre-COVID. Under COVID, it just accelerated more. And we heard from our distinguished speakers mention many ways in which the illicit trade has further been accelerated. And of course, it continues to create a lot of economic, social, political, and harms to public health and safety, as was mentioned. Again, we heard from Mr. Frost highlight and underscore, you know, how the illicit trade undermines our post-COVID recovery, and he also underscored the sense of urgency and how smugglers are nimble and really working to circumvent cooperative efforts across borders. So, you know, it is important, as LBC again underscored, on how we need to really develop our own network to fight these networks, and how we need to, you know, enhance our cooperation through public-private partnerships. LBC mentioned the good work of PMI impact and the need for greater information exchange and knowledge. And obviously PI, you know, informed our session today and all the good work that the OECD is doing through the Task Force on Countering Illicit Trade. A lot of evidence-based research from e-commerce to the implementation of the Free Trade Zones recommendation, the misuse of transport for counterfeit trade, and, you know, this new special project on high-risk sectors that we've heard Jeff also highlight in his presentation. So it is going to entail elevating our energies even more so through not only lessons learned, good practices, but really began on the enforcement and encouraging not only member states to implement their national strategies, as we heard from the government degrees, but really, again, to solidify this cross-sectoral cooperation with the private sector and civil society. I think civil society is very important in working through this coalition of networks to fight, you know, the illicit trade. Again, I commended earlier Cita Rios, who mentioned this plan of action, this new strategy for the government of Greece. You know, he mentioned how the government is working with the private sector on educating consumers in Greece during COVID on the impacts of pharma and other products, personal protective equipment like face masks and disinfectants. We heard as well from our colleague from the World Customs Organization on how they're working not only within their member states, but with Interpol, Europol, OLAF on this collective action. We heard some really important statistics and data on their disruptions and seizures related to stop operation too. And again, Price had highlighted the good work that they're doing. And again, I underscore the important work and the need to work with civil society and business associations. And, you know, one thing that Jeff did that underscore was the need to get back to basics on really, you know, leveraging the good work that we were doing before in law enforcement on enhancing deterring, on border controls. So again, you know, this meeting by business at OECD and the Federation of Enterprises in Greece is very important and timely. And I know that the organizers will be providing the summary, but I think there was a lot of good ideas, a lot of good suggestions, a lot of good ways to further strengthen that cooperation and support the good work that the Task Force and Counter Illicit Trade at the OECD is doing in partnership with business at OECD's Anti-Illicit Trade Expert Group. So again, hopefully we can digest that summary report, and we must continue again to work with Piotr and his colleagues. So with that, again, let me thank all of the speakers for the really thoughtful comments and presentations. Let me commend Business at OECD again with the Hellenic Federation Enterprises for their leadership in OECD, and not only in hosting this event, but bringing us together to advance our conversations in ways that we should be working together and leveraging our energies on countering illicit trade, on fighting corruption, on strengthening information sharing across borders, not only during the current pandemic and economic recovery, but hopefully again building this network to do more together. And finally, I had mentioned the Summit of Democracy, and again, I would like to commend Greece again, because it is great that we're having this event, not only virtually, but in the cradle of democracy, Athens, France. Athens, Greece. So thank you all for your partnership. Thank you all for your energies. Thank you all for working across sectors for leveraging our energies to counter illicit trade. With that, Nanette, I don't know if the organizers would like to have a last comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Luna. It was an honor for me for coordinating this conference. From what I heard from my point of view, I think that the key messages for tackling also illicit trade are strong political will, strong and effective partnership between public and private sector, and a need for well-informed consumers. Thank you very much again for your intervention. Approach the end of this conference, I would like to thank again our distinguished speakers for accepting our proposal and sharing with us so many interesting points for tackling illicit trade. I would also like to thank again Business at OECD for our excellent cooperation, and we are looking forward to new collaborations. Finally, I would like to thank you all for your presence today. I hope that this conference met your expectation and shed some light to the illicit trade challenges globally. Have a nice evening. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank
for
you,
attending. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you and goodbye to everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.